Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Business of YouTube podcast. It has been a while since the last episode, but we're very happy to be back. And there's going to be a very interesting conversation today and many more to come. So today we are jumping to the other side of the ocean, the other side of the pond. From the UK, we go to Canada, and we're going to have a very interesting chat with Paul McGrath from CBC. He has been in broadcast for quite a while. And there's a lot of history that is going to be interesting to listen to, and a lot of data as well. Like we're all about data and making things happen. And I think Paul is a good combination of the two things. So welcome on stage on the podcast, Paul.
Hello, welcome. Nice to be here.
So it's been interesting the way we actually got to know each other. We have been connected on LinkedIn, literally, and since then I noticed that your knowledge of YouTube has been extremely deep, and in a way as well that is. It's not just knowing YouTube or how it does work for business, but it's also how you approach it from a mathematical data point of view, which is something, of course, I like because I believe that it's all about content, but it's all about the data behind the content to understand the why and how. So I'm very glad that you accepted to be a part of the podcast.
Absolutely. I mean, I think some of that is kind of originating from my background. So maybe I'll explain a little bit and just start with who I am and what I do now, and then kind of get into sort of how I arrived there. So I'm the senior director for audience development, audience growth, as well as strategy execution for the entertainment division within CBC. So CBC is the Canadian public broadcaster, similar to BBC in Canada. We have two large divisions, an entertainment division and then a news division, and I have a responsibility over strategy execution for the entertainment division. One large area of focus that we have taken within that division is really to increase our reach and engagement from YouTube. And that has been a large strategic bet for us over the last year and a half or so. And I've been really in charge of executing on that bet and ensuring that we're maximizing the platform to the fullest extent possible. So that's kind of what I do.
Can you walk us through a bit, like what happened the last few years, because you've been in the industry for a long while and with different approaches as well, so it was not always the same thing. It was changing all over, like every other year or something. So what did you do with YouTube, or like in platforms from a broadcaster perspective? What's your experience there?
Well, I mean it's changed a lot, even personally, with my own personal involvement. I launched some of the first YouTube channels at CBC in 2006, so almost 20 years ago now, and those channels, and many of them, have kept operating now for a very long period of time, but as an organization, our focus on YouTube had kind of ebbed and flowed over that period. So there was a period from, I guess, roughly 2005 to about 2010, 2015, where we're heavily invested in YouTube. We're really excited about what was happening in the greater creator economy. We're excited about the notion of MCNs. We actually partnered with Fullscreen during that time to work with creators directly. We launched a creator network within CBC, so we had a network of creators that we could work with and commission content with. And, all of that resulted in quite a bit of growth over a 10-year period. Towards the sort of latter half of that 2010 decade, we increasingly became convinced that it was essential also to support a streaming service. So as a result of that, our attention shifted And we came to prioritize the development and growth of a streaming service. This is probably around in that period, 2015 to 2020, prior to the pandemic. And then really prioritizing, all of the work that needed to be done to build out a streaming service. And that was a very big learning curve for a legacy media organization, because you get into streaming and you get into a whole new set of things you need to learn. You need to learn product development. You need to learn how to interact with customers, how to receive payments. You need to learn about churn and retention. So there was a lot that needed to be built up in terms of sort of muscle and capacity to operate a streaming service. The pandemic hit, the streaming service grew, as did all streaming services and really all online consumption all over the world. And then as the pandemic receded, the streaming service was still healthy, but what we found was we had lost a lot of ground on YouTube. So there was 3 years in a row where we roughly lost around 25% of our total watch time. At the same time, in about the fall of 2023, we started to see the first reports of data that showed consumption across all devices. So you have the BARB data in the UK. Nielsen issued some early reports around this time in the US, and we saw the same sort of reporting in Canada. And they all kind of had the same conclusion, which was if you stack up all of your broadcast cable and all of your social and all of your streaming services in terms of total consumption, YouTube is often the number one platform. And that changes a little bit according to demographics and whatever. But the point of that for us was that, it was a bit of a sort of wake-up call. When we saw that data and we saw how large YouTube was, and the fact that in the previous 3 years, we'd really been declining on the platform, we were losing ground, we realized we need to reinvest here. We need to make a bet here. We need to put a focus on it. So that's what we did, started in 2024.
And there is one line that you actually made, and I told you already I'm going to steal it and use it. I will give total credit, which is it's about cannibalization, and it's still a topic. I think fair enough at the beginning of the industry. I think now still it's a topic, and I think we should be way past the point. It's like either you strongly have evidence that it is, or you strong evidence that it's not, and then you define your strategy as a business. Anyway, so the line that you were using is that now you need to prove me if cannibalization exists, then I can really believe that. But it's not the other way around. You need to prove me it doesn't cannibalize, because the starting point is always the conversation is about, okay, prove me it does not cannibalize, and therefore I may actually expand in different streaming platforms in general, not just YouTube. Although your point of view was well, prove me that there is cannibalization, and then I'm not going to go that way, which is the other way around. Can you just elaborate on that? Because I think it's a concept that is completely, it seems the opposite of what the main approach is, but in reality, that's based on data, and that's why I think that's extremely interesting.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to that. And as you know, I've been in the industry a while, and we've seen kind of rounds of this debate about cannibalization, because this came up originally when we moved from sort of linear to streaming. It came up again when we started operating on social networks to say, well, Facebook is probably cannibalizing our linear and or streaming audience. So, this is not the first time we've had this debate. I think in terms of the 2 points, there's broadly kind of a couple of things happening. One is cannibalization seems to be often taken as a fact in the industry that we then have to disprove, as opposed to questioning that assumption to say, do we have any evidence that actually happens? And when you look at it empirically and apply the right sort of scientific method approach to it, what we found, which is what we did, we found there was very little evidence to support the notion that it is actually happening. And we did that by looking at titles that had been published on both our streaming platform and on YouTube at different periods of time, in some cases simultaneously, and look at them in sort of from the date they were published on YouTube, after 30 days, after 100 days. Was there any sort of effect that would indicate or support the notion of cannibalization? And the end results were no. After we published titles on YouTube, what we found is, in some cases, our streaming service, the consumption almost doubled. So if you had a cannibalization effect, that doesn't support that hypothesis. It's the inverse of what you would expect. So, that's one kind of element in that. When looking at cannibalization, I think it's important to look at it in terms of what is an assumption here and what actually has been looked at and modeled out from a scientific point of view, and what does the evidence actually support. So that's thing one. I think the other element, though, about cannibalization that gets mixed up into this conversation is that people consider long-term trends of audience migration to be cannibalization. So in addition to that kind of debate around cannibalization, I think we can all agree that there are very long-term trends where the audience is migrating first from linear platforms to streaming platforms, and now from streaming platforms over to social platforms. And these trends are happening, over 10, 20-year periods. These are generational shifts that you see in consumption patterns from different generations. I feel like often that recognition of those trends and the idea that those trends are happening is getting mixed up into the cannibalization conversation. And it's actually two different things that we're talking about, because if we're talking about cannibalization, your hypothesis, the notion you're putting forward is IP on one platform can draw audience off another platform and attract it to that first platform. And maybe sometimes that happens, but when I studied that, there is no evidence of that happening. And at the same time, I think there is quite a bit of evidence on a long-term basis, on a generational basis, that different generations consume in different ways, which is causing these large long-term consumption shifts that we're seeing on linear and streaming and now on YouTube and social platforms. But they're not the same thing. So I think it's just important to distinguish those two elements.
Yeah, I hope you don't get offended with me that I'm going to use your line and giving you credit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's all public domain, right?
Yeah, still not public domain, but still not mainstream. Let's put it this way. But if you look at the data, and I think I remember having looked at the data in 2010 at MIPCOM. There was a panel. It was the 5th anniversary, 5th birthday of YouTube. There was, I don't know if you were there at MIPCOM, but I remember there was Patrick Walker, Jeff Nathan. There was Greg Dre. At the time, he wasn't at YouTube, or definitely not Animage. He was at Vivendi, if I'm not wrong, and there was Rai as well, and everybody was like showing that the data was saying the opposite. There was no cannibalization eventually, and it was really database. There were graphs showing it, which I was like, okay, you can go against the graph. I mean, numbers are numbers, then you can read it however you want. But I mean, that was fairly clear. There was no cannibalization back then. There was no evidence of the other way around eventually as well. And so it's a matter of, okay, how you take a decision from a business point of view, what is more strategic, and how you tackle the question there from a business point of view, and how you generate either new reach or new revenue or both, or however is strategic for you. But anyway, that was 15 years ago.
That's the critical point, though. I think you're asking that question is really such an important question. Like, instead of focusing so much energy on an assumption around, say, cannibalization, is it not better to look at, well, to what degree is that actually happening, and to prove it out whether it's happening or not? And then most likely, I think what you will find with most IP is that effect doesn't really exist in a very meaningful way or at all. I don't know what everyone else's research will say, but that's what we found. That allows you to adopt a different posture on this debate, which allows you to say, okay, so if that is not happening, what is actually happening, which is different audiences and different generations are consuming content on different platforms. That allows you then to say, okay, well, if that's happening, how can I use that effect to my advantage, or as a producer to your best advantage? If you realize, well, there's not a lot of evidence for cannibalization, but there is evidence that audiences are consuming, say, on YouTube, audiences are consuming on streaming services, and then a different generation of audience is also still consuming it on linear platforms. Linear platforms are still very large consumption platforms. And then you start thinking, okay, so instead of trying to protect and stop or halt a long-term audience trend, how do I actually swim downstream with that trend, and instead of trying to swim upstream and take advantage of it? So how do I think about amortizing my content or IP across multiple platforms, maybe in different windows, maybe in different territories? I don't know exactly, what all the pros and cons would be of different models, but it allows you to think about a different monetization model, which is really moving beyond kind of that traditional commissioning and distribution model that has governed a lot of, say, television and show business production for generations now. And particularly, you're coming from the UK. It is a business in the UK right now. I don't know if I'd use the term crisis, but it's definitely like a business where there's a lot of anxiety about what will the future hold. And I think some of that means that it's on us to think about how could we apply different models to create a more viable and sustainable business into the future. I think amortizing across platforms is a big element of that.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. Is like now it's the big question is, how do I leverage it? And then there's going to be like different approaches from, and of course it's a time where you need to take risks, because playing the usual playbook is not going to get the same results as before, because the world is changing. That's a fact, and it's a very different world, and is going to be a different world in 10 years. So the interesting part is actually trying to get most of the advantage and differentiate and have different strategies, and some will work and some will not, but still there is a lot of opportunity as much as there are risks out there. So
absolutely. And to that question, I think that is exactly the right question. How do I leverage it? I think, one of the things that we're talking about, and this is becoming increasingly common in talking with producers, is the idea of working with a media company to produce content, produce some show on some sort of commission basis, and then giving up a bunch of your rights across platforms to whichever media company commissioned that show, and then trying to retain a bunch of international rights so that you can spin that off and sell that in multiple territories. I don't know if that's the most viable model anymore. What we're often talking to producers about now is to say, there is the potential to create a unified global fan base around a piece of IP. But in order to do that, we can't really take your distribution and split it up into 10 different territories, because the net effect of that on the fan base is, they may see something on social about your IP, and then they click the link to go watch it because they're really into it. And then it's a black screen that says this isn't available in your territory. That approach, although it may be good in terms of sort of like distribution monetization, is really bad in terms of trying to grow a global fan base. So what we're frequently talking about is to say, okay, so if there is multiple partners in different territories and there's a commission here, can we try and work together so that instead of blocking access to fans in all these different territories, that we're opening access to allow the formation of a global fan base that can lift up the IP and make it more popular on a global basis? I think that is maybe the start of the conversation for what does a new model look like. And then what we're doing is, and what we're talking about now is, you can still do all the rev shares for this, but you split it on the back end as opposed to blocking the audience from being able to get to it on the front end. It's less hostile to the audience, and I think it's more viable in terms of trying to encourage these global phenomenons around IP. So, but it takes a different kind of set of partnerships and a different way to think about it. And the producers and the IP have to be really at the core of that. Because otherwise, like, you're left with kind of a model where you're splitting your territories, and it's very hard to unify them and unify that global fan base. I think that's probably more like the music model, but I'm not super familiar with how it works in music. But I think that's one of the things that as an industry, we need to talk more about this.
Yeah, more like what's the value chain and where there is an opportunity for value creation, and it could be mixed and different from the past, but still like putting the audience and the IP first, and the mesh of the two, and then it's just how you build and how you distribute and how you actually give it to the audience. There's never been more need of IP, and the audience wants more content, not less content. They want to be
right.
Want to consume more and more, like, and not just the main IP, could be as well like shoulder content. Everything around it is really becomes very emotionally attached to an IP. So it's way more than what it was before, technically speaking. It's like the fandom is bigger because there's more availability, and there's like more niches that are like very much into it. So it's less mainstream and more niches, which makes it more complex from one point of view, but as well there are more opportunities to develop like leaders in different niches, which there wasn't before.
That's right. Right.
Moving on, there is one point that I think is very interesting from your approach, which is everything is data-based or mathematically based, or there's always a model. So which is from my point of view very interesting. And so I wonder if you have any data points or analysis that was particularly taking your attention and that you want to share.
Well, so just to back up on that question just a little bit, I wouldn't say it's 100% everything is data-based. We definitely take an orientation around data, but what I find when working in this industry and in this space is there's kind of broadly, kind of a couple of sets of people. There's like the creative people, and then there's more the sort of like distribution people, which are often like data-oriented people. I find when those two sets of people are working really well together, they're talking together around the set, a shared set of data. And that data allows the creative people to do their job better, and it allows the distribution people to make better decisions about which platforms to distribute on and how to window and all of that sort of stuff. So yes, absolutely. We definitely take much more of a data orientation around the performance of our content than I think many companies do. I feel like that is a competitive advantage for us. I feel like generally in the creator economy in general on YouTube, there is much more data that's available to you than most creators are aware of, and definitely than most creators are actually using in a tactical way. And there's ways to think about that data that kind of demystifies a lot of your performance. So, like, I'll give you a couple of examples on that are related. One of the data points that popped out at us when we started looking at some of our content for 2024 in the last calendar year was about 20% of our total content that we make. So 20% of the total videos that we make drive about 50% of our watch time. So we started looking at that and going, well, what is that? And what is that phenomenon? It turns out that 20% that is disproportionately driving our overall performance is long form content. And it's content that's longer than 20 minutes. And then you think about everything else that's happening in the industry around the YouTube space. And, Neil Mohan and everyone from YouTube have been talking for a year or more about the importance of the living room. And they have the strategy that goes with that of owning the living room. And they've been spitting out like white papers and doing interviews and all of this. They are definitely oriented towards increasing engagement on the living room. So therefore, you would think in the living room, those watch time windows tend to be longer. If you are a publisher that's making more long-form content, chances are the algorithm would be sensitive enough to realize you're feeding the machine what it wants according to its strategy right now. So that all makes sense to me. The other thing, though, that we've found with that is the relationship between the long form content that we make, and then when we clip out short clips out of it and publish them as shorts, either on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, there is a strong relationship between the consumption of that content and then the consumption later of that long form content. And you see that same kind of relationship playing out actually on your streaming service as well. The short content is supportive of the long content. On YouTube, you can be really explicit about that relationship because you can actually, when you publish your content, say this short is related to this long form piece of content. What we're finding is that when we get short pieces of content that is published on YouTube and then surfaced frequently by the algorithm and therefore resulting in high impressions, we tend to get an impression lift on the long form pieces of content. So I think what's happening there is people are consuming the shorts, during the day on a coffee break or at the bus stop or waiting for the elevator on their phone or whatever. And it signals to the algorithm, this audience member has an interest in this topic. And then when that same audience member goes home and turns on the TV, there is awareness of that interest already being present, and the long form version, the horizontal version of that piece of content then pops out and is surfaced on your feed page. And then you have the option to click on it or not. So I think that relationship between those two pieces is really interesting. And I want to dig into it more, but in terms of a sort of opportunity space, that's the kind of space that would be very hard to be able to examine from a creative point of view. You need big data sets to be able to look at that, and big comparative data sets where you can look at the performance of shorts on one channel versus another channel and how much long form are they publishing and what are the relationships. This is where those two pieces to me kind of come together for powerful impact.
Well, speaking of shorts and long form, what we noticed by looking at data as well is like you can compare in a way the short form as an advertising campaign is like a marketing campaign, although it's an entertainment format on its own, and it can live on its own. It doesn't matter if it's linked or not, in theory, to a long form. Even if it's coming from the long form, eventually it will live on its own as a format. It becomes its own thing. But the reality is that it's basically, you can compare it to a free advertising campaign. It's a marketing push, right? That then drives to long form. So as a marketing campaign, as an advertising campaign, of course, you don't convert one by one, like everywhere.
That's right, yeah.
To a long form, but it does convert extremely well in terms of subscribers. Therefore, people that would most likely watch any other content about that format or others, specifically from a broadcasting perspective, could be like any from the broadcaster.
So that's an interesting point there, because so maybe the subscriber element is just one of those elements that's powering that relationship between the short consumption and the long consumption. And I'd like to look at that more as well. But here's what we find on that. We find that the vast majority of our consumption, like for whichever channel on any given day, I don't know, like 95% of that consumption is not coming from subscribers. So I kind of feel like, as a model overall, the importance of subscribers on YouTube has been diminishing over years. I'd love to know what you think about this, but I kind of think like it's accounting for such a small proportion of our overall consumption at this point. I don't know if it's the sub effect that's driving that kind of short conversion to long form, or it's just the fact that, you know, the algorithm is aware of all of your history and aware of what kind of short content that you're consuming in short windows on what topics and et cetera. And then it can feed that better. And it's likely probably a little bit of both happening at the same time. But yeah, like I was kind of negating subscribers as a primary driver, just because it doesn't account for a lot on our channels. But that may not be true across the board. I don't know if you've seen the same thing.
It depends on industries, to be fair. It does differ a lot from industry to industry. It's never the first driver, to be fair. Usually speaking, for a very developed channel or like bunch of channels, Shorts is number one driver of viewership. It's at least counting like 25+% of viewership, generally speaking. So if anybody is less than 25%, is because they don't have a strong shorts strategy, not because they don't watch shorts. And usually when we see 25% and above viewership from shorts, then it drives everything else, and therefore like there's then there are the other factors, like, and then it depends very much into the industries, both search, again, like it could be very different, or playlisting could be. Music is a lot of playlisting and search, for example. Sport is search, shorts, and a bit more of subscribers because of fandom as well. Like if you,
of course, yeah, right,
on one club, you want to make sure you know everything about the club, and then it might be, and then the algorithm. So depending on how much you're optimized, then it would be like how much is the algorithm pushing you through related videos or browsing, etc. So it slightly changes from industry to industry. Of course, subscribers is not the number one, but if people are subscribing, they're also engaging, and by any engagement that you do with the content, then is favored by the algorithm. So it could be like if you're watching a short, and usually shorts are pushed to people that don't watch your content, so it's really new audience. Then it tends to be, if people are engaging in a way which is subscribe or like or do any other action, or just watching for a decent amount of seconds the short, then the algorithm will favor you as well in terms of possibly watching other content.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. You know, it lines up, what you've just said lines up with something that we've seen on the data of one of our videos. And you said usually shorts are exposing your content to new audiences. And we have this one video that, oh my God, it's got like 50 or 60 million views at this point. And it's about, I don't know, maybe 9 months old. But when you look at the data for views on that particular video, what you see is these big spikes that drop down to 0. And then a couple weeks go by and another big spike, and then it drops down to 0. And then a couple weeks and another big spike, and it drops down to 0. And we were just looking at it the other day, and we were making the case that what this looks like to me is the algorithm just taking the same piece of content as a short and just exposing it repeatedly to different audience segments. And at this point, like in terms of the 50 million views, like people kind of think about it a little bit in the wrong way. They think, you're going to get a piece of content, you're going to publish it, it's going to go massively viral, and then it's going to slowly die out in some sort of long tail. But actually, it's kind of like, the algorithm is almost like playing keys on a piano. Like, first I'm going to try it with this segment and get a spike, and then I'll move over a couple more and try it with this segment. And in the data for that video, you can see about 9 of these spikes over about, I don't know, maybe 9 months. It's maybe even more than that. But there's such distinct patterns that it looks to me like it's just iterating through different audience segments within the algorithm and then exposing that content. And every time it does it and gets a strong return on it, I think it figures out, I'm going to do it again with another one, and then on and on and on. So it's just interesting to me that, like, people don't really think of it that way, but it seems like that's very much a pattern on YouTube anyways.
Well, the algorithm for shorts is very different than the normal algorithm for YouTube, because it's a push, it's not pull. It's like, it's the content. You don't choose the content; the content chooses you. It's just completely different usage. And well, talking about graphs, we actually take all the screenshots of very weird graphs of the pattern for shorts video. And to be honest, what you're saying is precise, but there is one type that is what you're saying. But there are many different types of kind of graphs that you can get from shorts that are completely different from any long form.
Interesting. Okay.
Long form is exactly what you're saying. It goes up, picks up immediately, and then goes down. And that's what it is. And you have 1% chance that maybe at a certain point it's gonna have a second life, but that's really a 1% chance because somebody's talking about it somewhere. And
right.
Shorts is completely different, and actually they have many lives. Many lives, and they go to different audiences. But not only, it's just the way the algorithm picks up, because maybe there's at a certain point there is somebody picking up slightly more than usual, and then it pushes it big time. So it's really a matter of quantity and frequency for sure. That what they've seen working at best as we speak for the last year and a half is quantity and frequency, because you're signaling in a very strong way to the algorithm, but at the same time, you can read the data afterwards, because you really need to have enough data to do the analysis. But at the same time, it's not as mature as the long form in terms of data. So you will see very, very different approaches in terms of data. And that's the opportunity right now, because they are still learning as well. The algorithm is learning.
Of course, yeah, right.
So, and that's the big opportunity where quantity and frequency really, really matter to grow a massive audience. We're always pushing for that. And generally, there's a lot of, like, I don't know, people are sometimes saying, okay, but then I'm leveraging shorts, and then people are not going to watch my long form, or like it's just.
Well, that goes right back to the cannibalization conversation that we're having off the top.
And that's very common. You have no idea. But then once I was talking with a record label, and that was very interesting. I was talking to this guy, and we were talking about shorts, and I was expecting to have the usual conversation, like, yeah, but shorts, long form, whatever. And the guy was like, I love shorts. And I was like, how do you do? Like, how many do you publish per day? And I was like, well, we actually break through an artist from 0 to 1 million subscribers in less than a year. And I was like, okay, wow. That's speaking. Okay, how many do you publish? And I was like, I bet you're publishing 20 to 25 a day. And he was like, I'm publishing 50, and I wish I could publish 100. I don't have capacity to do 100.
Interesting.
And I was like, okay, well, you are my God for now, because I usually beg people to publish 2 a day, and it's already like begging, basically. It's like 2 a day. It's impossible. But going and getting an artist from 0 to 1 million subscribers is building a career.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It has profound impact for that artist, and also, like, to think back to the start of this conversation and the conversation about cannibalization and the fact that, what we've found is that effect doesn't really exist as much, at least in our data. And what we've found is, it tends to be additive. We're not the only one that studied this. Natasha Ritzik studied this at Warner Brothers as well with a very large data set and found the same effect, that short form content is additive to audience development on streaming services for the titles that they looked at. So there's a bit of a sort of stand back from that a little bit opportunity as an industry, right? What we're seeing is YouTube as a platform has developed the products and the ability to cater to the audience when they only have time for, say, a short window of short form consumption or an inclination towards that, maybe on a phone, maybe elsewhere. And their product is working very effectively. And they also have a product that can cater to, living room, long form television consumption. And what we know from the industry research is there's a nice correlation and an additive effect between that short stuff and that long stuff. That can happen on YouTube, and that can also happen to support a streaming service. So that in itself is an opportunity. And then it also makes me think about the other platforms, say TikTok, where there isn't a long form version, and makes me wonder, do you think that they will develop as part of their product offering a long form version? Because they understand this effect as well, just as much as anyone else does. So that makes you think, okay, so will TikTok get longer? I suspect they will, because they can also, their creators can take advantage of that effect. And then I think about that also in terms of creators. And there's a lot of creators that, especially in the last couple of years, that are only publishing shorts. And that kind of goes back to, if you want to be effective in terms of creating sustainable and viable long-term businesses in the creator economy or as a media company, you got to think about, how can I amortize across different formats and different platforms? If you're working as a creator and you're only making shorts, then you're not really taking advantage of that long form opportunity, which can also increasingly be monetized and can help build up your fan base. So it's really a matter of thinking about how can you take advantages of the different opportunities emerging in the space. But I think this dynamic between short and long is one that increasingly you will see start playing out across different platforms. I expect to see more of that from Instagram, from TikTok. We already have it from YouTube. And I expect media companies really dig in and take much more advantage of that. As long as they're not too hung up on the whole sort of cannibalization piece of it.
Fair point. And my 2 cents on TikTok, well, it reminds me of the playbook of YouTube. At the beginning, it was very short form. It was then expanding.
You're so right.
It's not very different. It's just, well, of course, TikTok started vertical because they started in a different era. So they were no mobile when YouTube started in 2006. End of the story. But the length of the videos are already expanding on TikTok, and that's exactly the same playbook, because people want to consume more and more content. So especially if you're going after advertisers, then you want them to actually advertise more and better, and ultimately going back to what linear TV is, which is a bit funny. It's like platforms they start like, we are not linear TV, and then they end up being TV, and
that's very true.
But it's funny if you look at that, but that's the reality, because that's where advertisers are still, most of them. I mean, still the big bucks are on TV.
Yeah.
That's
the other element, I think, as as industry, analysts and experts, that we need to be thinking about as well, is that what is the pace of sort of monetization between television, especially things like CPM rates on television, and places like YouTube or TikTok? Because if you're like me, where I'm advocating for a model of distribute on many different platforms and amortize as much as you can, that works, but it only works to the extent that you can actually make money off some of these platforms. So the CPMs need to go up. I expect over time that will happen and will continue to happen, but I think it's something that we all need to watch out for, right? Like, it's not like the CPMs on YouTube right now are matching what you're getting from television or some of the streaming services. So hopefully that will balance out over time, because that's really critical to create a sort of sustainable long-term business.
Well, different models needs to search as well. Like I've seen, especially broadcaster being the best one in selling advertising, to be honest, compared to other industries eventually. The best out of it. So I think it needs to be developed from the platform, but as well like from different industries, where like they find the right place to make the right business model to actually get the right revenue for it. Because I don't think we are there yet for every industry, and as well, like the industries are just thinking, okay, the CPMs, but there's many more ways to actually make money out of YouTube.
Right. Actually, yeah. And you've talked about that a lot, and that's a very fair point. It's not just CPMs. It's,
and most of the times you could make more money. It depends on the industry, of course. If you're into a broadcaster, mainly you're looking at the audience and monetizing through the usual approach, which makes sense. It's the right approach. But if different industries might have a completely different approach to it, but I most of the times it needs a lot of questions to actually get the right answers.
It's so interesting. I mean, there's a whole set of activities that I find in having worked on YouTube with creators, and then working also, in a media company, where you can look at the other side of the fence and look at what creators are doing and realize they have so much to teach media companies. They understand intuitively how important things like thumbnails are. They understand intuitively how important things like hooking the audience in the first few seconds of your video is, which is a skill set. Like, those two things are skills that many people in media companies don't have an inherent understanding of the importance of that. And it's so critical. And on the monetization piece, like, they inherently understand that, monetization needs to be coming sure from ad revenue and maybe channel memberships and merchandising and events and everything else. And many media companies are still haven't diversified anywhere near to that extent. So I feel like there's a lot to learn from both sides of the industry. I feel like the media companies are better on the sort of distribution end of it and fast channels and everything else like that. But it's just an interesting space that way, because I don't find they talk to each other that much. Like, you don't find a lot of like sort of media leaders talking to creators on a regular basis with that posture of, what can I learn from you? I'm curious to know what you know after, operating 10 or 20 or years on YouTube. They've learned so much.
So look, I think that this topic is very valuable. What creators and media companies, traditional media companies, should learn from each other. And I'm launching you like a challenge now, if you want to take it. Why don't we do another episode, and you can talk from your point of view of a traditional media, which understands very much the creator economy as well. And we have somebody from the creator economy, and from the other side.
I love that idea.
How about that?
Yeah, let's get a long-term creator, or someone that's like working in one of those emerging creator studios like Mythical or Darman or whatever, to provide both points of view. Because yes, absolutely, there is a lot. Yeah, I would love to do that.
Challenge accepted.
Pardon me?
Challenge accepted.
Okay, challenge accepted. As long as I don't have to pour ice on my head. I don't want to do the ice bucket challenge, but I'll do this one.
That's okay. Well, thank you very much, Paul. It was very interesting, and I'm glad you got into the podcast, because you have a really good experience to share, and it was a pleasure talking to you. And I'm looking forward to the challenge of creator economy and traditional TV learnings.
Perfect. Yes, absolutely. A pleasure for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.